At 54, 3 weeks after she signed the divorce papers she had been putting off for 6 years, Bonnie Sherritt sat at her kitchen table in Perry Sound with $340 in her checking account, a cardboard box of things Ray had left behind, and a key she did not recognize. The key had been inside a coffee tin at the back of the hall closet. Not Ray's closet. Her closet, the one he had never once opened in 22 years of marriage. She had found it while packing, the way you find things when you're finally cleaning out a life you stayed in too long. It was small and old, brass gone dark at the teeth, attached to a piece of tape on which someone had written in handwriting she did not know. "Bonnie, keep this. You'll need it more than I did." The handwriting was not Ray's. Ray printed everything in block capitals, the way engineers do, the way men do, who have been trained to be legible but never learned to be readable. This was a woman's hand, looped and careful, and Bonnie did not know whose it was. She did not know what the key opened. She did not know why her name was on it. She had spent 22 years thinking she knew everything important about her life. She was wrong about most of it. And if you stay with us today, we'll tell you what that key unlocked, and why finding it changed not just Bonnie's life, but a whole stretch of the Perry Sound waterfront. Before we get into it, if stories like this one mean something to you, take a second and hit subscribe, and drop us a comment telling us where you're watching from. We love knowing how far these stories travel now. Let's talk about Bonnie. Bonnie Sherritt had grown up in Perry Sound the way a lot of people grow up in small Ontario towns. Knowing the names of everyone's parents and the makes of everyone's trucks and the approximate details of every divorce and accident and kitchen fire for the past 40 years. She had met Ray Sherritt at a Thanksgiving bonfire when she was 29 and he was 32, and what she had taken for steadiness in him turned out, over time, to be a different thing entirely. Not steadiness, absence. The lights were on and nobody was steering. She had tried. The way you try when you have built a life somewhere and don't know how to unstack it. She tried for the first decade the way you try with your whole heart, and then she tried the way you try when your heart is mostly tired. And then somewhere in her late 40s she stopped trying. And they became two people who shared a house and a joint account, and a habit of watching different shows in different rooms and calling that a marriage. Ray wasn't cruel. He never raised his voice and he never raised his hand, and the worst she could say about him was that he made her feel like furniture. Present, occasionally useful, never actually seen. He traveled for work, pipelines out west, 2 weeks on and 1 week off, and she had come to prefer the 2 weeks he was gone to, the 1 week he was home. That told her most of what she needed to know, and she had known it for years. She just hadn't done anything about it. Until the February she turned 53, when she sat down at the kitchen table, with a cup of tea going cold and the particular kind of quiet that follows a holiday neither of you mentioned. And she thought, I am going to be 70 years old and I will have spent it being furniture in my own house. And she went and got the number for a lawyer. It took 14 months. It was not ugly as divorces go. Ray signed what he was asked to sign, and did not contest the house, which was Bonnie's anyway from her mother's estate, and drove away in his truck one Tuesday morning in November without looking back, which was somehow worse than if he had looked back. She was left with the house, a 12-year-old Subaru, $340, and the sense that she had finally done the right thing about 15 years too late. She was packing the last of his things to drop at his brother's place when she found the coffee tin. The tin was an old one, nabob, the kind her mother's generation kept rubber bands and spare buttons in. It had been pushed to the very back of the hall closet behind a box of winter boots she hadn't worn since her knee surgery. She almost tossed it without opening it. Something made her pull off the lid. Inside was the key and nothing else. She turned it over in her hand. She read the tape. Bonnie, keep this. You'll need it more than I did. Her mother had been dead for 6 years. The handwriting wasn't her mother's. Her mother had written in a tight, compressed script that never quite lifted off the page. This was different, open and unhurried, the handwriting of someone who had all the time in the world and was not afraid to use it. She set the key on the kitchen table and made herself another cup of tea and looked at it for a long time. The next morning she took it to her neighbor, Phyllis Brulé, who was 78 and had lived on their street since before Bonnie was born, and knew the history of every household within 6 blocks, the way other people know hockey statistics. Phyllis looked at the key through her bifocals, and then looked at the tape and then looked at Bonnie. That's Irene's writing, she said. Irene who? Phyllis set the key down on her kitchen table. Gently, the way you set down something that belongs to somebody else. Irene Vachon, she said. She owned your house before your mother bought it. She moved away. Oh, it must be 30 years ago now, maybe more. Lovely woman. She used to keep the most extraordinary workshop out back of the property, behind where you put the garden shed. Bonnie thought about the garden shed. She had put it up herself 8 years ago, a kit shed from Canadian Tire, because Ray wasn't going to do it, and the garden tools were piling up on the back porch. She had cleared out the space behind it once, years ago, and remembered finding an old concrete pad cracked down the middle, the kind of foundation you pour for a small outbuilding. She had thought nothing of it. What kind of workshop? She asked. Phyllis thought about it a long moment. I'm not sure I should be the one to tell you, she said finally. I think you'd better go find out yourself, but I'll tell you this. She slid the key back across the table to Bonnie. If Irene left that for you specifically, she left it for a reason. She wasn't a woman who did things without a reason. Bonnie drove to the town registry office that afternoon. She pulled the property history for her address going back 40 years, and there it was. Irene Margaret Vachon, sole owner, 1979 to 1993, sold to Patricia Ann Gendron, Bonnie's mother, for $87,000. Irene Vachon would be in her late 80s now if she was still alive. There was no forwarding address on the sale document. There was nothing to go on, except the key. She went home and walked to the back of the property, past garden shed to the cracked concrete pad. It was August, and the goldenrod had grown up through the cracks, and there were years of blown leaves packed into the corners. But at the far edge of the pad, half buried in the sod where it had sunk over decades, was a metal door set flush with the ground. A cellar door, old-fashioned, the kind that laid flat and opened upward. She had walked over it 100 times without knowing what it was. She had assumed it was a drainage cover or an old utility access. She had never thought to pull on it. She pulled on it now. It was heavy and the hinges had rusted, and it took her 3 tries and a length of 2x4 as a lever before it groaned open. Below was a wooden staircase, solid despite the years, leading down into a stone-walled room about the size of a one-car garage. And at the bottom of the stairs, fitted into a door she had not seen from above, was a lock that matched the key exactly. She stood at the top of those stairs for a full 2 minutes. The air that came up was cool and dry, the way the air inside stone stays when it's been undisturbed. There was no smell of rot or water damage. Whatever was down there had been sealed well. She went down. If you've made it this far and you're feeling that pull, that need to know what was at the bottom of those stairs, we're right there with you. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the rest. Because what Bonnie found in that room is something we've been sitting on since we first heard this story, and it's not what anyone would guess. The room was full of quilts. Not stacked haphazardly, not bundled in garbage bags the way people store things they don't care about. They were folded with the precision of a person who understood that folded things, properly stored, could outlast the person who made them. Each one was wrapped in unbleached cotton muslin, tied with linen twine, and labeled with a small card in that same open, unhurried hand. The labels were names, dozens of them. Bonnie walked between the shelves reading them in the beam of her phone's flashlight. Angelique Boivin, 1987. Teresa Marchetti, 1989. Darlene Koopman, 1991. Ruth Okafor, 1991. Betty LaRocque, 1986. There were 43 quilts. Bonnie counted them twice. At the end of the last shelf was a tin box, not unlike the nabob tin from the closet. Inside it was a small notebook, the kind with a red cover that used to come from the Dominion store, and a letter addressed, in that same hand, to whoever you are. She took the notebook and the letter upstairs, back into the August light, and sat down on the concrete pad in the goldenrod and read. The letter said, "If you have found this, you have found the key, which means you are living in my house, which means Patricia is gone. I am sorry for that. She was a good woman and a better friend than I deserved. I am leaving this explanation because the quilts deserve one, and because I will not be coming back. I am not a writer. I will be brief and you will forgive me. From 1979 to 1993 I made quilts in the room below you. I made them for women in this town who had nothing. Not decorative quilts, working quilts, bed quilts, the kind that keep a child warm through a Parry Sound winter when the heat is unreliable, and the landlord won't answer the phone. I made them for women who had left bad situations and were starting over in bad apartments. I made them for women whose husbands had died, and whose children were small and whose bank accounts were what yours probably is right now, if you are reading this when I think you might be reading it. I did not do this through any organization. I did not want paperwork or recognition or a board of directors. I wanted the quilts to go directly from my hands to the people who needed them, and I wanted the women who received them to know that a stranger had sat for 60 or 80 or 100 hours, making something specifically for their family, which is a different thing from receiving a donation. I kept this room because I did not want anyone to feel they owed me anything, and because I made some of the quilts from cloth I couldn't entirely account for the provenance of, and because in a small town, being known for charity is its own kind of complication. The reason I am leaving what is on the shelves is this: I ran out of time before I ran out of purpose. I moved away to care for my sister and I could not finish delivering them. The women on the labels are the women they were meant for. Some of them will have moved. Some of them may no longer need them. Some of them may be gone. But if any of them are still in Parry Sound, those quilts belong to them. I am trusting whoever finds this room to use their judgment. The notebook is a record. Every quilt I made, every woman I made it for, every hour I spent, and whatever I knew of their situation. I kept it because I wanted to know that the work was real and not lost. I am leaving it to you because if you are reading this letter you are, I think, the right person to have it. You'll know if that's true. Irene Vachon, 1993. Bonnie sat on that cracked concrete pad in her August garden, 30 years after Irene Vachon had locked that door, and read that letter twice. And then she sat quietly for a while. She had found the letter 4 days after her divorce was finalized, sitting on $340, with no job lined up and no plan, and the distinct sensation of being a person who had sat down somewhere unfamiliar, and was waiting to find out what to do next. She thought about that line. If you are reading this you are, I think, the right person. She thought, I don't know if that's true, but I'm going to find out. She started with the notebook. Irene had kept records the way a careful person keeps records. Dates, names, circumstances, fabric descriptions, hours. There were 43 entries. Some were brief. Angelique Boivin, 2 children, ages 4 and 6. Left husband December 1986. Birchwood Court apartment. Twin quilt in blue and yellow cotton, 72 hours. Some were longer, 3 or 4 sentences, about where the woman had come from and what she was facing and what Irene had tried to put into the pattern. There was one entry that was half a page. A woman named Teresa Marchetti who had come to Parry Sound from Sudbury with nothing, and 2 teenagers and a broken collarbone that she'd told the hospital she got from a fall, and for whom Irene had made a quilt in deep greens and burgundy that the notebook described as the colors of a forest, because I wanted her to feel surrounded by something that couldn't be taken from her. Bonnie read that entry 3 times. She went looking for them the way you go looking for things in a small town, carefully, indirectly, through the people who have been there long enough to remember. She went back to Phyllis. She called the public library and asked if they knew of a Darlene Koopman. She asked at the Giden on a Tuesday afternoon when she knew the older women came in for euchre. She was not always sure how to explain what she was doing, so she learned to say it simply, I found something that belongs to someone, and I'm trying to return it. That sentence, it turned out, opened doors in ways she had not expected. Phyllis knew Darlene Koopman, who was now Darlene Gothy and lived out on the Muskoka Road with her daughter. Darlene was 64 now. She had been 27 in 1991 when her name went into Irene's notebook. She didn't remember a woman named Irene Vachon. She remembered a quilt arriving on her doorstep on a February morning, with a note that said only, "This is for you," and crying about it for an hour, because it was the first thing anyone had given her since she'd left, and she hadn't told anyone she was struggling because she was too proud and too afraid they'd tell her to go back. Bonnie stood on Darlene's front step and watched the woman's face while she told her this. Darlene was someone's grandmother now, with reading glasses on a beaded chain and a hummingbird feeder by the front window, and when Bonnie unwrapped the muslin and opened the quilt across the porch railing, blue and rust and cream, hand-stitched, still bright after 33 years in that dry stone room, Darlene put both hands over her mouth and didn't say anything for almost a minute. "She made this for me," Darlene finally said. It wasn't a question. 68 hours, Bonnie said, because she had read the notebook entry. That's what it says. Darlene touched the stitching along one edge with one finger. 68 hours, she said. I didn't even know her name. Bonnie found 18 of the 43 women in the end, or their daughters. Or in 3 cases, their daughters who had received the news that their mothers were gone, but who sat with the quilts anyway. and held them in a way that said the object mattered, even if the recipient was not there to receive it. Some of the women had moved away decades ago and could not be traced. Some she simply ran out of thread on. Wrong address, wrong name after remarriage, no way forward. But she found 18, and with each one she found, she sat with them long enough to hear a small piece of what 1986 or 1989 or 1991 had looked like for a woman on her own in a northern Ontario town with not enough money and too much to carry. She heard about the women's shelter that used to be on Mary Street and had since closed. She heard about the housing co-op that had helped 4 of the women on the list get on their feet. She heard about a network of neighbors and church ladies and library workers who had quietly helped women in bad situations get to better ones. An informal chain of care that nobody had organized and nobody had named, and that had mostly dissolved now because the people who held it together had gotten old or moved on. She heard again and again a version of the same sentence. There used to be people who just helped. You didn't have to apply for anything or explain yourself to anyone. Someone just showed up. And she heard about Irene Vachon, pieced together from 18 different memories of the same woman. Tall, quiet, with gray eyes and very direct way of looking at you, who had run a small alterations shop on the main street for years, and who had apparently spent every hour she wasn't altering other people's clothing making quilts in the room behind her house. For women she barely knew. Nobody had understood the full scope of it while it was happening, because Irene had been so deliberate about keeping it quiet. She didn't want gratitude, Darlene told Bonnie. She told me once. I ran into her at the pharmacy. She said gratitude makes people feel like they owe you something, and women who already have too much to carry don't need more weight. Bonnie thought about that on the drive home. She thought about Ray and the 22 years and the $340, and the question of what she was going to do now. She was 54 years old. She had a house and a degree in textile arts she had never used, from a program she had finished the year she met Ray, and then quietly set aside because it didn't seem practical. She hadn't sewn anything since her 30s. She had told herself for 20 years she wasn't sure why she'd ever taken that program, but standing in a stone room surrounded by 43 quilts made by a woman who had kept her reasons exactly as private as her methods, she thought she might finally understand what she had not told anyone yet. Not Phyllis, not the women on the list, not even her daughter Kathleen, who called every Sunday from Guelph, was that she had found the last thing in the notebook 2 weeks after she first opened it, folded into the back cover and taped down so flat she had nearly missed it. It was a cashier's check, made out to Bonnie Sherritt, for $14,000. Bonnie had sat with that check on the kitchen table for 4 days before she could think straight about it. Irene Vachon had known her name. She had known whose hands the key would end up in. She had known, somehow, that the person who found the room would be Bonnie, specifically. Not some stranger, not a contractor clearing out the property, but the woman who would end up in that house at the right time, with the right kind of emptiness to fill, and the right kind of hands to fill it with. Bonnie's mother had told Irene about her. Phyllis confirmed it later, gently, when Bonnie came back with the check, and too many questions she didn't know how to ask. Patricia and Irene had stayed in touch for years after the house sale. Bonnie's mother had known, long before Bonnie knew it herself, that the marriage was wrong and that the divorce was coming, and that her daughter was going to come out the other side of it, needing a reason to get up in the morning. She had told Irene, and Irene, who believed in practical kindness more than any other kind, had made a plan. Bonnie sat with that information for a long time. Her mother had been dead for 6 years. She could not ask her why she hadn't just said something, hadn't just sat down with Bonnie at some kitchen table years ago and told her, "Leave Ray. Here is what I've arranged. Here is a place to land." She would never know if her mother had doubted herself, or doubted Irene's plan, or simply believed that some lessons had to arrive in their own time, and not a moment before. She thought about what she would say to her mother if she could. She thought she would probably just sit there in the quiet and hold her hand. And then, because she was 54 years old and not too old to start, she decided to stop sitting with things and start doing something. This would be a good time to pause and just say, if this story is landing with you, if you're feeling what we're feeling right now, please hit subscribe and tell us in the comments what part of this hit hardest. Stories like Irene's don't get told enough, and we want to make sure this one travels as far as it should. Now, here is the part where it almost went sideways. There was a property developer named Cam Finch who had been quietly buying up older residential properties in the Parry Sound area for 2 years. He had made an offer on the house next door to Bonnie's 6 months ago and had knocked on her door in the spring, before the divorce was finalized, with a business card and a number he said was more than fair. She had told him she wasn't interested. He had said he understood completely and left his card. He came back in September, 3 weeks after Bonnie had started making inquiries around town about the women on the list. Because in a small town nothing stays quiet, and word had gotten back to someone on the zoning committee that the property at Bonnie's address had an unlicensed underground structure of unclear status, and Cam Finch had a way of knowing when those kinds of flags went up. He arrived in a company truck with a woman from the municipal office and a copy of a bylaw Bonnie had never heard of, and he stood on her front porch being pleasant, in the way that is more alarming than unpleasant. The structure on your property, he explained in his pleasant way, was an unlicensed habitable space, under current municipal code, and depending on how it had been built and what it had been used for, it might need to be assessed, and assessed structures sometimes triggered remediation requirements. And remediation wasn't cheap, and a property in Bonnie's situation. And here was the unpleasant thing inside, the pleasant thing, the blade inside the velvet. A property in transition, newly single ownership, no income on record. Might find it easier to simply sell and let a developer with the resources to handle remediation take the problem off her hands. He had a number in mind. He named it. It was not insulting. It was carefully calibrated to be just enough more than she could refuse if she was afraid. Bonnie looked at him. She thought about the 22 years of going along. She thought about what it had cost her to not make the fight earlier, and what it had cost her mother to know and not say, and what it had cost Irene Vachon to do everything quietly, because the world did not make it easy to help people loudly. She thought, I am 54 years old. I have a degree in textile arts and $14,000 and 43 quilts and the names of 18 women who remember being helped by a stranger. I am not afraid of a man in a company truck. Thank you, she said. I'll look into the bylaw. She went back inside, and the first call she made was to a woman named Ghislaine Fortin, who Darlene Gauthier had mentioned in passing as someone who used to do housing advocacy work, and who still knew everyone at the municipal office. The second call was to Kathleen, her daughter, who turned out to have a friend who was an architectural historian, with a particular interest in legacy community structures, and who said on the phone with a kind of controlled excitement that an intact mid-century stone root cellar adapted for use as a community workspace was actually, depending on the documentation, potentially eligible for heritage designation. The third call was to the town library, because the library had a local history archive, and in the local history archive, Bonnie was told, there was a folder on informal social welfare networks in the Parry Sound area 1970 to 1995. And inside that folder was a photograph of a woman named Irene Vachon standing in front of an alterations shop, smiling, holding a quilt. The photograph was 28 years old and Irene was already gray-haired in it. Bonnie looked at the straight posture and the direct eyes and the hands holding the folded quilt. Competent hands, a maker's hands. And she thought about 68 hours to make one quilt, for a woman you barely knew, in a room no one was supposed to see. The heritage application took 4 months. Ghislaine knew the right people, and Kathleen's friend wrote a supporting document that described the underground workroom as an example of informal matriarchal infrastructure, which was a phrase Bonnie had never heard before but which seemed, once she heard it, to be exactly right. The application went through in January. Cam Finch sent a brief email in November, when it became clear that the heritage application was going to succeed, saying he had reassessed his portfolio priorities in the area and would not be proceeding with any offers in Bonnie's neighborhood. Bonnie did not respond to the email, but she did not delete it either, for reasons she didn't fully examine. On the Saturday after the designation came through, Bonnie held an open house. Not a real estate open house. The other kind, the older kind, the kind where you open your door and let the neighborhood in. She set the remaining 25 quilts out on the beds and the tables and the chairs, labeled with the names from the notebook, and the years, and the hours, and she invited the women who were left on the list and several who had heard through Phyllis and Ghislaine in the library, and a reporter from the Parry Sound North Star who Kathleen had called without asking first, and who Bonnie had decided, after a moment of irritation, was probably right. Darlene Gauthier came with her daughter, who was 30 now, and had grown up under that blue and rust quilt, and was somehow both surprised and not surprised to learn where it had come from. Teresa Marchetti, now Teresa Lapierre, had driven up from Barry with her older daughter, who was in her 40s, and who stood in front of the quilt in the deep greens and burgundy, and cried in the way adult children cry when they are finally allowed to understand something their parent protected them from. An older woman named June Auclair, who had not been on the list at all, came because she had heard about it through the Legion, and said only that she had known Irene and wanted to pay her respects, and stayed for 3 hours and told Bonnie more about Irene's quiet logistical operation than anyone else had managed to piece together. And at the end of the afternoon, a woman Bonnie did not know, small and young, maybe 30, with a toddler on her hip, and the particular kind of careful composure that Bonnie had come to recognize from the notebook entries, came and stood in the doorway and said she had seen the article in the North Star. She said she had left a situation in September and was in a 2-room apartment on Tower Hill, and that she wasn't sure why she had come exactly. Bonnie looked at her. She thought about Irene in her stone room with the door locked, 68 hours at a time, making something that was meant to say, "You are surrounded by something that can't be taken from you. I'm glad you came," Bonnie said. "Come in." Her name was Yasmin. Her daughter was named Clem. They stayed until everyone else had left, and Bonnie made tea, and they sat at the kitchen table the way women have sat at kitchen tables in every house in every town, for as long as there have been kitchens and tables and things too heavy to carry alone. And Bonnie listened to what Yasmin had to carry. And then, because she was 54 years old and had a degree in textile arts she was not going to set aside. Again, the room was clean now, warm, lit with 2 good work lamps. The shelves were still there, and the work table Bonnie had built herself from 2 sawhorses and a piece of plywood, because she needed a surface, and there was no one to build it for her. On the table was the quilt she had started in November, her first in 20 years, worked slowly and imperfectly at first, and then with more confidence, the way things go when you are doing them for the right reason. It was almost finished. It was in yellows and soft grays, the colors of a Perry Sound November morning, because Yasmin's daughter was 2 years old, and what she deserved was morning colors. She had been sitting with the notebook entry she was going to write. She had the red notebook, Irene's, and a pen, and she had spent 3 weeks deciding whether she had the right to add to it. She had decided she did. She had written, Yasmin, daughter Clem, age 2, December 2024, yellow and gray morning colors. Started December 14th, hours, ongoing. She had left the last line blank, for now the way Irene had left the last entry in the composition book blank. Not because the story was unfinished, because some things are still happening while you write them, and the honest thing is to leave room. The $14,000 had paid for fabric and batting, and the 2 good work lamps and 3 months of groceries, while Bonnie figured out what she was doing. She had applied in January for a small arts grant through the Ontario Trislium Foundation, for something she had decided to call the Vachon Workroom, which was going to offer free drop-in quilting instruction on Tuesday and Thursday evenings for anyone who needed to learn a practical skill and could not afford to pay for lessons. She had not gotten the grant yet. She was going to apply again. Phyllis had brought over a sewing machine in December, an old Bernina that had been her sister's, saying she couldn't use it anymore with her hands the way they were, and it was just sitting there. June Auclair had found 2 bolts of cotton muslin in her basement that she had bought years ago for a project she'd never started. Darlene's daughter had shared the North Star article on 3 different community Facebook groups, and the response had been, as Kathleen said on the phone, a lot. Bonnie had not expected a lot. She had expected to work quietly the way Irene had worked, and perhaps she still would, mostly. But the door was open now. She found the folder that winter while she was going through the last of the boxes. She hadn't unpacked when she moved back into the house properly after Ray left. It was the folder she had kept in the bottom drawer of her dresser for 6 years. Not divorce papers. She hadn't gotten that far, but a folder of job listings and workshop schedules, and once a printout of a textile arts continuing education course in Sudbury that she had almost registered for in 2018, had already filled in her name on the form, and then had not sent because Ray said the timing wasn't right, and she had agreed that the timing wasn't right, and put the folder in the drawer, and closed the drawer, and let herself forget it was there. She looked at the printout. She looked at her own name in her own hand, filled in and waiting for the rest of the form. She took the whole folder out to the backyard, to the spot by the old concrete pad where the goldenrod had gone brown and brittle in the winter cold, and she lit it with a barbecue lighter page by page and watched it burn, and she did not feel triumphant, and she did not feel guilty. She felt the way you feel when you take your coat off after a long time of wearing it inside, and realize how heavy it had gotten without you ever noticing. She had been so sure she knew what was practical. She had almost let that certainty take her remaining years, the way it had taken most of her middle ones. And now, because a woman she had never met had locked something away in a stone room 30 years ago, and trusted the right person to find it, Bonnie had a workroom and a notebook and a quilt on the table that was going to be finished by the end of the month, and a reason to go downstairs every morning before the light fully came up over the Georgian Bay horizon and begin. There is a small bronze plaque on the door at the bottom of those stairs now. Bonnie had it made in February. It reads, Vachon Workroom Est. 1979. Kept open. The 2 words at the end were not from Irene's letter. They were Bonnie's addition. She had thought about what to add for a long time, and in the end she chose the simplest version of what she wanted to say to anyone who came down those stairs. That the woman who built this room had kept it open, and that the woman who found it intended to do the same, and that the work that happened here was not finished, and would not be finished, and was not supposed to be finished, because some things are not a project to be completed, but a door to be left open for whoever needs to come through it. Irene Vachon is 91 years old and living in a care home in Rouen-Noranda. Bonnie found out in March, through a contact Ghislaine had who knew someone at a seniors resource center in Abitibi. Bonnie wrote her a letter, not an email but a real letter, on paper, the way you write something you want a person to hold. She told Irene about the room and the quilts, and the 18 women and Yasmin and Clem, and the grant application, and the Bernina from Phyllis's sister. She told her about the notebook, and that she was still adding to it. She told her about the plaque. She mailed it on a Thursday morning, and then she went downstairs and worked for 4 hours, and did not think about whether she would get a response. She got one 6 weeks later. It was brief. Irene Vachon had not been a writer in 1993 and was apparently not one now. The handwriting was shakier than the tape on the coffee tin, but still recognizably the same open, unhurried hand. The letter said, I thought you might be the one. I'm glad I was right. Don't stop. 3 words. Bonnie read them at the kitchen table with her tea going cold, the way she had read the first letter, and she thought about all the things a person can leave behind, without knowing exactly who will find them, or when, and how the only way that kind of trust works is if you believe that the right person will arrive at the right time, and know what to do with what's been saved for them. She was 54 years old, with $340 and a key and no plan when she found the room. She was 55 now, and she had a workroom and a notebook and a plaque and a quilt on the table, and a woman named Yasmin, who came on Thursdays and was learning to sew a straight seam with a steadiness that surprised everyone, including herself. She had Phyllis across the street and Ghislaine in her phone, and Kathleen calling every Sunday, Juno Claire, bringing fabric. She found in her basement, and Darlene Gauthier's daughter, sharing things online in ways Bonnie didn't entirely understand, but was grateful for. She had, in other words, exactly what Irene had made in that stone room for 30 years, and what her mother had hoped the key would unlock when the time was right, and what nobody had told her the name of, which turned out to be this. A reason, a room, a door that stays open. She turned off the work lamp each evening and climbed the stairs and locked the door behind her. Not padlocked, just turned the key, the original key, the one from the nabob tin, and stood for a moment in the backyard in whatever the weather was doing. Some evenings the Georgian Bay light was the particular pink it gets in the last 10 minutes before dark, and it came through the cedar trees and lay flat across the old concrete pad where the goldenrod would come back in August. And Bonnie stood in it a minute before going inside. She was not the woman who had signed divorce papers on a Tuesday in November and sat at a table with 340 hours and on a box of things left behind. She was not quite yet the woman she was going to be. She was somewhere in the middle, which is where most of the real work happens. Not at the beginning when everything is possible, and not at the end when everything is settled, but in the long, imperfect middle where you learn the patience, one Thursday evening at a time, to sit beside someone who is struggling with something hard and say nothing at all except quietly, when they get it right, there it is. Keep watching for more stories like this one. If Bonnie's story meant something to you, leave us a comment. We read every single one, and tell us about a door someone left open for you, or a door you've tried to leave open for someone else. Subscribe if you haven't already, because next time we have a story that starts with an old ledger found in a closed hardware store, and it goes somewhere none of us expected. We'll see you then.